I'm going to talk to you today about what I'm calling the university game. So I'm trying to bring together different strands of research. I'm going to talk about different research projects that I've been working on lately, with the idea that they're all connected in the sense that they're about the increasing tendency towards game playing within higher education systems at different levels. So the three particular games that I'm going to look at are participation games, i.e. who goes to university, which are played by universities and students. What I'm calling excellence games, which I think many of you will be familiar with, the games that involve trying to demonstrate and advertise excellence. And lastly, funding games, the games about how you bring in money to universities and how university money is distributed. And throughout that, my focus isn't so much on who are the winners and losers in the games, because I think plenty's written on that. My focus are what the games actually are, significantly how the games are talked about. So I'm interested in doing quite a lot of critical discourse analysis of public discourses around universities, because I think they're very important in terms of the way they shape policy. What the consequences of these games are for those of us who are in higher education one way or another, and what the consequences of these games and game playing behaviours are for society at large. Okay, if there's anything you're not sure about, then feel free to interrupt me. So the metaphor of the game is one that's used by Bourdieu a lot in educational research. And Morgenson says that arguably the most sustained theorisation of HE is by Bourdieu. And it occurs quite a lot in a kind of more everyday sense. So Paul Trowler and colleagues says, to be successful nowadays, a university needs to play a number of different games. So it's a fairly well-established metaphor within the discourse. And the reason I like the metaphor is because, as Craig Calhoun says when he's talking about Bourdieu and the relationship between his research and higher education, no game can be understood simply by knowing the rules that define it. It requires having a sense of the game, a feeling for how to play. So I'm interested in how, if you see higher education as a series of games, some people are better equipped to have a feel for the game and a sense of how to play those games. And I'm also interested, as I mentioned, in the idea of language games, which draws on my kind of scholarly history, because, as Wittgenstein says, the speaking of a language is part of an activity or a form of life. So what we do is created by the words we use to describe it. Okay, bringing it back to UK higher education, here's a cap of recent changes to the system which relate to the kind of things that I want to talk to you about. So the main changes we've seen recently involve liberalisation of the markets around higher education in the UK. So in England in 2012, undergraduate fees were raised to £9,000 a year as a maximum. In 24, we saw the Research Excellence Framework, the most recent iteration of a research audit, which I'll talk about. In 2015, last year, we saw the cap on undergraduate student numbers removed, which means that individual universities can recruit as many undergraduate students as the market allows. Last year, we saw a consultation and then the decision to freeze the repayment threshold for graduates at £21,000. So when the system was introduced in 2012, the deal was that once students earned £21,000 or more, they repaid at 9%. Above that threshold, and the threshold rose with inflation. But last year the government U-turned on that a little bit and said, as an austerity measure, that threshold has to stay at £21,000, it won't continue to rise. Last year we also saw a green paper in higher education, the two main themes of which were probably deregulation, i.e. new providers coming into the market, and the Teaching Excellence Framework, which I plan to talk about a little bit as well. And this year we've seen student maintenance grants replaced by student loans. That's probably been the big change this year. So where does this leave us? Well, if you look at the cost of university in the EU amongst all countries, you can see within England in the dark red, we are significantly more expensive than anywhere else. There are still some countries where higher education is free at the undergrad level, and at most other countries it's much cheaper than the fee that we operate. So, how's this been evaluated? Well, one thing that's interesting is a kind of discourse, public discourse, that emerges from the government. This is Joe Johnson, who's the Minister for Universities and Sciences, and he says we're one of the only countries, he says, in the world to have found a way of sustainably funding HE. We've seen record numbers of young people entering higher education, including record numbers from disadvantaged backgrounds. And through all this, the UK has retained its place as a world leader with 4 universities in the global top 10. So as far as the government's public discourse is concerned, the changes have been successful. So the first thing I want to look at is to try and evaluate the extent to which this is true. So here's a basic diagram which shows one of those issues that was raised, the proportion of disadvantaged people that enter university. And the claim, which you'll probably come across quite a lot in public discourses, is that there are more young people from disadvantaged backgrounds than ever who go to university. And this is true. Here you can see the 5 socioeconomic quintiles, so 20% of the population in each. The wealthiest is the purple line at the top. The least wealthy is the red line at the bottom. And if you look at the red line at the bottom, you can see that there's been a sustained increase over the last 10 years from around 12% to around 17%. That's the odds of going to university if you're born into the lowest quintile of disadvantage. But there are a couple of things to note here. First of all, the figures that you see will always relate to 18-year-olds only. And once we start to look at older students, you see a massive decline. So this graph shows a proportion of students aged 26 and over that are entering higher education, and we've seen a huge fall in that number. And of course, those students, older students, mature students, tend to be more likely to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but they're not included in the stats for 18-year-olds. We've also seen a big drop-off in the number of students who are part-time enrolments within HE, and again, they tend to be students who are from a less advantaged background, and those numbers have dropped substantially. And this graph is an interesting one which came to light a couple of weeks ago, which shows which kind of universities the disadvantaged students are actually attending. And what it does is measure the increase since 2009 according to groups of universities. So here we've got the top 10 ranked universities, which would include University of Manchester, then those ranked 11 to 20, and then those outside the top 20. And you can see it measures the overall increase in participation. And the numbers are actually very low. I don't know whether you can see the y-axis, but for not for Russell Group universities, for top 10 universities, the increase is about 0.7% since 2009. For other universities, it's about double that rate. So what we're seeing is, although there are more 18-year-olds who are going to university, and that's a headline figure from poorer backgrounds, we're seeing those young people going to non-elite universities, possibly for good reason. But that is a pattern, and we're not necessarily seeing that pattern emerge amongst mature students or part-time students. Okay, so the first piece of research I want to tell you about tries to answer the question, why aren't young people from disadvantaged backgrounds being deterred from participating in higher education? So in order to do this, I spoke to some young people who fit the bill. All of them were aged 14 to 16, so this is around the time they were making decisions about participation. And they all attended one of 3 large high schools in one of the 5 most deprived local authorities in England. And significantly, they all had the academic ability to win a place at a leading English university. So I could look at their test scores, map them against the national average, and then check that they had the academic ability. So these were from very low participation neighbourhoods, very low participation schools. And I was interested in their discourse. A lot of what they said reflected previous research in this area by people like Diane Ray and her colleagues, who talked about a culture in university that maybe didn't encourage people from that kind of background to feel as though they would fit in. So one of the students said to me, I don't know whether I'd be into doing all that kind of stuff. I don't really know if it's me. There was also an over-reliance on what might be called local narratives. So one student said, my stepdad gets £1,000 a week and he never went. Another said, it's too much unless you know you're going to love it. My sister's mate doesn't love it. She comes home every weekend. I also found doubts about authenticity, which again had been pretty well noted in the literature. One of the young people said, it's like, what would your mate say, isn't it though? Whenever you come back, it'd be, you reckon you're better than us now, do you, and all that. There was also distrust in outcomes. I showed them a graph which plotted future earnings against the amount that would need to be repaid. Hi Andy. The amount that would need to be repaid over time. And one of the questions which cropped up from a number of students was, well, that's okay if you end up being a lawyer or an accountant or whatever, but how many of us lot ever get up there? And they pointed to the upper end of the graph. So this tends to show that they were very aware of what was going on. They were very reliant on local narratives, but they were also thinking more strategically as well. There's also a distrust of their own ability, which was worrying because they were quite high achievers. But one said that would be the worst thing of all. Imagine you get there and you're paying all that money and it's just like, sorry, you're not clever enough. Uncertainty about the rules and language of the game. So these were reasons why students didn't want to enter. One of the students said, I know it's £9,000, but is that £9,000 for the whole thing or just £9,000 every year? A lot of students didn't understand the rules of the game that they would be required to enter into. The words, the language really tripped them up. So I talked about bursaries quite a lot, and after I've done about 16 interviews, I realised that none of the students had a clue what the word bursary meant. And why should they? The word bursary is really localised to higher education. They're never going to encounter it any other time. And in fact, only one of the 198 participants knew what the word meant. And then the most difficult question of all that they asked was, I don't get why it's gone up so much. This was just after the rise to £9,000. They said, what are you getting now that you didn't used to be getting? And that really is a difficult question because, of course, there was no real substantive change in the product that was being sold. There was just a trebling of the price. Okay, so these were reasons why there was suspicion of higher education, which made me even more curious to understand why there wasn't a drop in the national rate, that bottom quintile line. And one of the reasons that emerged strongly was participation justified or motivated by the absence of other games. And one thing I heard repeatedly was questions like, well, what else is there? It's not like there's jobs, is it? What else are you going to do? Another student said, I'll probably go, yeah, may as well. It's either that or I don't know. There was a lot of kind of fatalism about the future, really. Another student said, I'm not thinking about the money or the future. I'm just like, and then she put her hands over her ears and started singing. These were strategies that the students were using to block out the enormity of the debt, to block out the future. And maybe one of the reasons why, for 18-year-olds from those poorer backgrounds, we haven't seen a dip so far. Okay, I'm interested in contrasting that against the wider public discourses of participation. So this guy's called Martin Lewis. He runs Money Supermarket or MoneySavingExpert.com, and he was charged with being head of the Independent Task Force on Student Finance. So he was given a key position when fees were increased in 2012. He was given a key role in terms of trying to explain the changes to students. And as you can see, his approach was very much one that revolved around encouraging participation. So the booklet he wrote was called You Can Afford to Go, and he often did these kind of live performances at big events where he'd stand in front of lights, things like you don't need cash to go to university, and messages would flash out behind him. The kind of approach that he took in these booklets that he released were as follows. He'd say things like debt levels are irrelevant to most people. You just keep paying the same proportion each month. So he's very dismissive about the level of debt. He'd say if you don't earn enough, you won't come close to paying back what you borrowed, never mind the interest, which is true, but it's a very specific spin. And he even described, interestingly, fees as a psychological deterrent. So what he meant was you can't possibly be put off by fees. It's only a psychological deterrent. It's not a real deterrent. The fact that the price has gone up, don't worry about what people are saying. And this was reflected in more formal discourses as well. So Vince Cable, addressing the House of Commons, said, we've got a progressive graduate tax. It isn't about fees and there's no fixed debt because you don't have to pay it. And he said the problem, this was when riots were going on in London at the time, the problem is with a failure of presentation. There's no problem with the model, it's just how we're selling it. It's a progressive graduate tax. Is it a progressive graduate tax? Well, it's not in the sense that the wealthiest graduates pay significantly more than middle earning graduates. This graph demonstrates that actually once you get to the higher end of the earnings range, on the right hand side of the graph, you actually see a dip. That's because the very highest earning graduates actually pay their debt back quicker and therefore pay less interest on the debt. So to describe it as progressive is slightly misleading, though it is probably more progressive than the model which actually replaced before 2010, which is more of a contribution model. Lord Brown wrote the report which led to the introduction of this model, and he says we estimate only the top 40% of earners on average will pay back all of their charges paid on their behalf by the government up front. For all students, it's a risk-free activity. The returns to graduates for studying will be around 400% on average. And Michael Gove, sorry to flash up a big Michael Gove, I should have warned you really, shouldn't I? He says, some people will apparently be put off applying to our elite institutions by the prospect of taking on a debt of this size. And then he says, which as far as I'm concerned is all to the good. This is Michael Gove trying to be clever. What he's really saying here is, if you're too stupid to work out that it's in your interest to go to university, you haven't got the intelligence to be at a top university. So this argument was peddled very heavily, very strongly in defence of higher fees. These are the graduate premiums, and when you look at this, it's not 400% on average. This is the amount you earn additional to your income for going to university. relative to what you would have earned if you got the same A levels and not gone to university. And as you can see, in some subject areas like medicine and dentistry, there's a huge graduate premium, but in other areas, there's hardly any graduate premium at all. And in some areas, it's actually a negative graduate premium. These figures are from BIS in 2011, but the IFS remodeled this last year, and it was almost the same results. It also depends on sex a great deal as well, whether you're male or female, and I'm going to come back to that later. So public discourses of participation aren't always influenced by the full picture. Now, the Sutton Trust and the Institute for Fiscal Studies released a document in 2014 which actually modelled how much payback would involve. And they said a typical teacher who's in work each year and earns the average earnings amongst teachers at every age will still owe around £37,000 at the age of 40 and will be expected to repay about £2,000 a year throughout their 40s and 50s. That's how the new model will go forward. They then updated it, under the previous system, I should say, a typical teacher would have paid off their debt by the age of 40. They then remodelled this information based on the freezing of the repayment threshold and said that if the repayment threshold was frozen for 5 years, which eventually became policy, the typical borrower would repay an extra £2,800, and if it's frozen to the end of the repayment period, which is now pretty much expected, the borrower would repay an extra £11,000, and that's there's a gender difference there as well, because it's £4,000 more if you're female and male, because women tend to be lower earners than males. So these are significant figures, and once you actually start to model in the long term, then I think the argument is being made that it's not quite so straightforward, it's not a risk-free activity, and there's a clash between the public discourse and maybe the reality. Interestingly, going back to Martin Lewis, he realised this after the government changed its mind on the threshold. So he said very recently, when it launched a new system, the government promised that the £21,000 threshold would rise annually with average earnings. It's reversed that and frozen the threshold. And his point is, how can future students trust the system if they know the government can change the deal once they've already signed up? And the last time I saw him on Twitter, he hired 2 lawyers to investigate challenging the government over this student loan retrospective hike. I don't think he'll get very far with that. Okay, I'm going to move on to a different kind of game now. That's a broader picture, but I'm interested in participation games, and particularly participation games around selection, because what I'm going to argue is that these games go on and are played out in public discourses at all levels of higher education. So I'm going to look at the attainment gap. Now, the attainment gap's huge and is often listed as one of the differences for that gap in the first diagram that we looked at, where we looked at participation rates according to socioeconomic quintile. And just to put that into perspective, the number of young people from society's most disadvantaged quintiles who get the very top qualifications that will get you into the top that will get you into the top universities each year is around 1,880. They're individual students who get the very highest grades but are from the poorest backgrounds. And if you compare them to the total number of young people from the most advantaged backgrounds, it's about 17,500. So this is obviously a reflection on and a statement on the educational system. And often the line from universities is, well, we can't offer students places if they don't apply. And that's a Russell Group strong line. It's mostly about the attainment gap. It's not our problem. We can't do anything about this. We can't correct for previous educational disadvantage. And that's a position which is supported by the data. But there are other observations as well. For example, there are 3,000 missing students every year from state schools who get the grades to attend the top dozen or so universities, but who end up elsewhere. You've always got to be careful when presenting statements like this, because in some cases they may legitimately make the right decision to go elsewhere. There may be other courses that are more suitable for them. There may be other factors involved. But nevertheless, there probably aren't 3,000 students from independent schools who get the right grades and end up elsewhere. Also, as Vicky Bolivar from Durham University has noted, applicants to Russell Group universities from state schools are only about 2/3 as likely to get an offer as privately educated applicants. And this surprises a lot of people, but if you go to a private school, your chances of being made an offer with the same grades are substantially lower than if you attended a state school. There can be all kinds of explanations to that, and some of those explanations can't be controlled for. For example, it could be that they're applying to the wrong courses. It could be that they're over-aspirational. It could be that they're getting bad advice and guidance and therefore making the wrong kind of choices. So it's hard to model those kind of differences. But one thing that I was interested in is whether the admissions process itself makes a difference. And that was particularly reinforced by these stats, which also show there are worrying differences when it comes to ethnicity. So if you apply to a Russell Group university and you're white, you've got a 52% chance of being made an offer, and if you're black African, it falls to 35%. And that's, again, controlling for academic attainment. So these are applicants with the same grades that can be controlled for. And you can even break this down according to individual universities, and there's a gap for all individual universities. So why is this? Well, I've written a couple of reports for the Sutton Trust because they were interested in the admissions process itself and whether that was one of the reasons why some students were being disadvantaged. The application process says you need to demonstrate your enthusiasm and commitment and stand out from the crowd by writing a personal statement. Personal statement, you'll probably remember them when you wrote them, 4,000 characters of free text. You have to write about yourself and sell yourself essentially to a university. The issues with personal statements, once you start looking at them very closely, is that they are very differently composed depending on the background of the applicant. So for this survey, I looked at hundreds of personal statements that were all written for applicants to the same university, the same department of the same university, by applicants with identical grades who went on to achieve identical A-level grades. Here's just one of the indicators I looked at. UCAS say you've got to make sure you don't make any spelling mistakes and your grammar's good. So I started counting up errors. So I started counting up things like spelling mistakes, apostrophe misuse, and I found that if you went to a private school and a grammar school, you're talking about half a mistake per 1,000 words of text compared to, from a comprehensive school or a sixth form college, 2.5 times per 1,000 words of text. What does this signal? Well, you remember that these are applicants with exactly the same A-level results, so it's not about ability so much as about the context in which the context in which the statement was written. So these are students who don't have family to turn to, who don't have schools, who have support mechanisms in place and can check the personal statement, and maybe don't understand the importance of the personal statement either. What was even more interesting in terms of the kind of game playing things which I'm interested in is some of the non-quantifiable linguistic errors, things that you couldn't actually count. But I found students often saying things, students from sixth form colleges and comprehensive schools saying things like, the aforementioned points all advocate my enthusiasm for this course, which isn't actually ungrammatical, but it doesn't sound great, does it? The unmistakable link between three subjects is one which only enthuses my passion to study it further. I counted the amount of passion in those statements and love, and it was almost 3 times higher than in those from the independent schools. And one student saying, I'm not sure what makes me interested in the subject. I don't have an exact reason to be truthful. I love it as a whole. Most of all, I love getting to the bottom of the puzzle. These are actual statements that the applicants used. They're responding honestly to the prompts that they're given by UCAS, but the problem is there's no real exchange value here in terms of getting them into a top university. Cultural capital, while some students did cordon bleu cookery courses in London and love to entertain public audiences with their musical abilities, again, there was a big difference. My main interests include spending time with friends, watching films, going to the gym, reading up on the latest fashion and attending gigs. I attend a lot of gigs and the experience and the atmosphere puts me on a complete high. So this is inappropriate. It's a lack of advice. They don't know what they're doing, and it might be one of the reasons why there was a gap in outcomes in terms of likelihood of being made an offer. Social capital is an interesting one. Social capital basically relating to who you know and the kind of contacts you've got. A lot of students from independent schools, a lot of them had an uncle who had an aircraft brokerage and marketing company and were able to talk about those kind of work experience opportunities. One talked about his father who was an entrepreneur, created and sold businesses. So if you're able, Bourdieu talks about the dispositions to be and above all to become one of us. So Bourdieu's talking about how people get into elite French educational establishments, and he's saying you need to be able to talk a certain kind of language, signal belonging in certain kinds of ways, and these students are attempting to do so. It could be rejected by a smart admissions tutor who's very on the ball and clued up and able to contextualise, but that doesn't always happen. I'm not sure admissions are always processed in that level of detail. It's also interesting that the UK is very unusual in terms of the UCAS process. So the personal statement itself, the idea of giving students at the age of 16 and 17 a blank piece of paper to write about themselves, were basically unique in the world. in terms of doing this as a higher education admissions agency. In America, the discourse is different. There's much more focus on the idea of putting a class together. These quotes are from a recent book about meritocracy in admissions, and there's a quote from an Ivy League select or admissions person who talks about building a multicultural community, and the big book in this area is called Creating a Class. They want diversity, and there's an active discourse around educational advantages to having a class that's made up of people from different backgrounds. The quotes in this book are very interesting from people who are selectors at Russell Group and Oxbridge universities. For example, we like having diverse students, says an admission tutors, but we take the best people. Which, it's an interest. I mean, it hinges on the word "but," really, doesn't it? Because clearly, by using the word "but," you've set up a contrast. Diversity is really at odds with merit in this case, or perceptions of merit. So I think there's an issue that's unique to the UK about how we select people and how those games are played. Okay, often when I'm teaching in this kind of area, I say to people, I challenge them and say, who are you going to give a place to? Imagine you're running a course, you've got 2 applicants, one of them's got A-level grades of A, B, B, and went to an independent school. One's got slightly lower grades, but went to a much lower achieving school, and I ask people to tell me who they give the place to, and I've done it hundreds of times, and usually it's a fairly even distribution. Once I've asked people to comment on that, I then show them this graph, which shows your likelihood of getting a good degree based on your school background, and what a good degree is a first or a 2-1, and what this graph shows is if you're on the red line, i.e. you went to a state school, the odds of you getting a good degree are higher than if you went to an independent school at almost every single level of prior attainment. And Dan and I and Maria have done this kind of research at University of Manchester, and it's the same as a national picture. There's always a gap there, and that justifies the people who chose Sean and gave the place to Sean, because his chances of getting a good degree are exactly the same as Chloe's, even though her A-level results were higher because of her background. So this raises questions about the use of contextual data and about universities playing the game differently and starting to think about the context in which grades were achieved. It's not always so straightforward. If you look at the data in a lot of detail, you'll also see that actually Chloe is more likely to get a high degree because she's female. So that raises an issue. Are you going to take gender into account as well? Chloe's also likely to get a higher degree because she's white, because we know that white students do much better than non-white students at university. This is one of the things which we're interested in at the moment in trying to work out why, but the differences in attainment amongst white students who enter university with the same prior attainment as non-white students are absolutely huge. White students have got a 20% chance of getting a first, but for some of their ethnicities, it's only 7 or 8%, again, controlled for prior attainment. That reminds me of Bourdieu's work on what's important being less about what's explicitly taught and more about what's tacitly taught. And there's a lot of research now about the culture, the curriculum of higher education, and why such a difference arises. The other problem with using contextual data is that Melanie Phillips from the Daily Mail will shout at you, because she writes this piece almost every time it comes into the public discourse. And she says the most egregiously unjust social engineering by which universities are doing the government's bidding is to force up the proportion of students from comprehensive schools and poor backgrounds by rigging the system against the middle classes. So this is a right-wing media complaint to any suggestion from universities that they may contextualise prior achievement. It says everyone has the right to reach their potential. That means everyone must be treated equally if they pass the same test of merit, but now merit and aspiration are being penalised out of ideological spite. This kind of argument's made quite very forcibly. And just in case you weren't sure, the headline of the piece is "These insidious social engineers are destroying merit and aspiration." This is anyone who thinks that maybe context plays a part in educational attainment and should be factored in to university decisions. So public discourses matter and maybe prevent progress in certain areas. We also start to see in an increasingly neoliberalised higher education environment, statements like this one. You may have noticed last week that British universities slipped a few places down the league tables. One response that came from one university was to say, this is because universities are taking their eye off the ball of recruiting the best to comply with government demands to increase the proportions entering and graduating from state schools, ethnic minorities, and postcodes from which in the past few students have come. So this is a direct connection being made between the way in which universities operate in a neoliberal environment and their perceived attempts to widen participation at the cost of excellence, which I'll come on to in a moment. Excellence game. The dominant logic about excellence seems to be, having read all of the policy documents that have been issued around higher education recently, excellence has to be demonstrated. We have to demonstrate that we're excellent, for example, so funding can be distributed. So the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, is used to demonstrate what's known as QR funding, quality-related funding. We must always make excellence public, so that, for example, students can make informed choices. That's one of the reasons it's always given. And also, the more subtle one, but there's a sense that all this talk of excellence makes everyone even more excellent. So David Willett constantly talks about rising tide floating all boats, and I'm convinced that with some policymakers, they really do believe that simply by talking about excellence, and that actually does raise the standards of things. So how does this play out? Well, we see lots of rankings. There are lots of rankings, and the proliferation of rankings has really changed the sector in recent years. In fact, let me show you my favorite ranking. This is a ranking of rankings, okay? This is in answer to the question they asked university managers, when you want to see how good an institution is, which website or league table do you refer to? And the Times Higher was second, and it was the ARWU, which was top. There are lots of different ways in which we're ranked. So what's the problem with this? Well, one problem is that behaviour modifies itself towards winning in terms of the league table. So if we look, for example, at grade inflation, I've just taken the Guardian's league table of higher education as an example, but they're all pretty similar. You get this value-added score, and a value-added score is essentially calculated by taking universities' average entry grades and then applying a formula which then compares that to the likelihood of winning a 2-1 or a first degree. And the HEA say that nearly half of institutions have changed their degree algorithms to ensure that students aren't disadvantaged compared to other institutions, i.e. they calculate degrees differently. It's hard to get hold of stats in this area, but there are 3 universities that have the information publicly, and Cambridge University over a 30-year period increased their proportion of first from 13 to 23%, Warwick from 3% to 23%, and Exeter from 4% to 19%. And this is standard game playing behaviour where there are league tables because universities want to do what they can to improve their score. Likewise, with average entry tariff, another indicator on league tables that maybe works against other agenda. I was talking about contextual data and widening participation. If you want to genuinely widen participation and widen opportunity for people from non-traditional backgrounds, then you will be taking students with lower entry grades. But one of the things that universities are judged on are how high their entry grades are and their average tariff. Likewise, career after 6 months is often considered problematic because 6 months is a very short period. And these indicators come from basically the National Student Survey, which is conducted every year. And the results of the NSS each year, well, they're good news in a way. Look how much better we've got since 2005 to 2013. Huge improvements in almost every area. They're the raw scores. What happens behind the scenes, it's hard to say. Universities are much more maybe likely, some would say, to placate or pleasure their students, as someone said a couple of weeks ago, in terms of how they actually deliver their teaching. And it could be that there are other things going on here. One thing that I've noticed, and I've drawn attention to this a couple of times before, but this is a phenomenon the pollsters call yay-saying. Yay-saying is when if you ask someone to do a survey, there'll always be a proportion of people who just answer the same one because they're fed up and they want to finish doing the survey as quickly as possible. Now the black line here shows how many different maximum number of repeated responses. Okay, so it's a number of repeated responses. There are 22 questions on the NSS. The black line shows how many there were back in the first year of the NSS, which was 2005. And as you can see, it goes down like this. But this stripier barbershop line shows the difference in 2013. And you can see there are almost 5 times as many students who just hit the same button every time. They're not interested. They're not really given feedback. They're just going through the motions, and they tend to give the highest possible grade. And that basically accounts for most of the improvement within the NSS scores over the last few years, if my calculations are right. I wouldn't be entirely dismissive of the NSS. We mentioned ethnicity before. And it's interesting, when NSS data is broken down according to ethnicity, which doesn't happen every year, and the information isn't widely publicised, but it is interesting to see that, for example, white students, when it comes to academic support, how well supported they feel, report a positive difference from the average, whereas every other non-white group reports a negative difference from the average. And these surveys are huge. They're based on over 100,000 people completing these surveys every single year. So these differences, although they're all less than 5%, they're very significant. Okay, the excellence game when it comes to teaching, one of the policies that the government have in mind, as you know, is to apply the ref logic to teaching. And David Willett says teaching's been by far the weakest aspect of English higher education. It's lamentable, according to Joe Johnson, but the backlash will say, well, student satisfaction is not an accurate measure of the quality of education. I'm grateful to Ruth for pointing this out to me in the Times yesterday. This is a feature which says lecturers should be given star ratings by students immediately. This was an idea by Anthony Selden, who's now the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckinghamshire, who thinks that this is how it should work. We should, according to 10 criteria, which you can read about in his report, we should instantly get feedback from students. So we're seeing a policy context in which students are empowered and teaching is reduced to something quite immediate rather than something that might have a longer term impact. Teaching evaluation. Before I start on this, just think of a lecturer that you had when you were at university who was a genius. You got one in mind? Hands up if it was female. One, two of you, that's all. This is one of the problems with teaching evaluations, okay? This is some data that was very clever data that was collected by a guy called Ben Schmidt, and he took the Rate My Professors site in America, which is a very well-developed site where students go online and do provide individual starred ratings for their lecturers. And he looked at keywords. His database was 14 million words of data. And he looked how many times the word genius was used by students to describe female lecturers and male lecturers. The blue dots are male lecturers, the female dots are, the orange dots are female lecturers. In other words, conceptions of genius and also knowledgeable and awesome and hilarious and brilliant are almost entirely reserved for male lecturers. Now, if you think about some of the policies that are in place which require teaching evaluations to be at the centre of things like promotions, to be at the centre of evaluations of universities, it's very worrying when the data is as sexist and unreliable as this. If you're interested, women tend to be bossy, helpful, nice, and available. The excellence game when it's applied to research audits. The history of research audits, they were first introduced in '86. With 4 grades of outstanding, above average, average and below average. Then there was one in 1989 which introduced units of assessment. Then we saw 3 research assessment exercises and 1 research excellence framework, which was quite recent. They do have them in other countries, but not very many. I had to look hard to find them. In Australia, they've just introduced an excellence in research for Australia. I think it was introduced in 2010, but I'm not sure it's actually taken place yet. Germany have something called a Forschung. Sorry, I shouldn't have tried to say. Germany have an equivalent, but it's very contested and academics aren't very happy about it. So do research audits work? Well, the Robbins report is the only British evaluation of research reports. That was back in 2003, although there have been some about individual aspects like metrics. But they report that they stimulate universities into managing their research and ensure the funds are targeted at areas of research excellence, and they talk about a marked improvement in universities' research performance as a result. But there are critiques as well, and Derek Say is probably the main critic, and he says that research audits are tailor-made for self-replication and legitimation of established hierarchies and networks and lead to the monopolization of whole fields by entrenched orthodoxies, marginalizing critical perspectives and ossifying disciplines. So the criticism is usually that what exercises connected with research audits do is they marginalize some academics, they make the whole process much more instrumental, and also they cost a lot of money. So the figures, the official cost estimate for the last ref is £246 million across the sector, although actually it's probably a vast underestimate when you think of how much money individual universities are putting into maximising their performance. Interestingly, one of the strongest criticisms of the ref comes from last year's HE Green Paper, which says we must address the industries that some institutions create around the ref, and the people who promote them. There are cases of universities running multiple mock refs, bringing in external consultants and taking academics away from teaching and research. Yeah, no shit. On a lighter note, I did spot this in the Times Higher last year. This was in the kind of presented as a dating site, me, academic with monograph and other publications, you, university in need of quality contribution for your ref submission, panel D, and that's the best line, isn't it? Discretion expected and assured. These are academics marketing themselves because they know they've got exchange value within the higher education system because they've got monographs and they want to be picked up and paid by other universities. So this is how the game playing in its most extreme form might take place. Is there an alternative to research audit? I was interested in this research from LSE, which came out last year. Let me try and explain this. The blue dots represent how much research income universities were able to bring in competitively over the last research audit period. Okay? And the argument being made is that if you look at how much research was brought in by competitive bidding to the funding bodies and then map it against how much was delivered by QR, because of the ref, then it's almost identical. In other words, how much money universities are able to bring in competitively is basically a reflection of how well they did in the ref. In other words, the argument would go, you could actually save £250 million on the ref just by giving the money away based on performance in other areas. Of course, then you could say, well, that would become a game and universities would start to play that, but maybe it would take away from the potential divisiveness that research audits cause within the sector. This is my favourite argument against research audits. This guy's Peter Higgs, theoretical physicist who discovered the Higgs boson particle and won the Nobel Prize in 2013. He says in an interview with the Times Higher, I became an embarrassment to the department when they did research assessment exercise. A message would go around saying, please give a list of your recent publications, and I would send back a statement saying none at all. He said he went for over 15 years without publishing anything while he was working on his major discovery. And there is an argument that research audits do tend to reward immediate findings and tend not to focus on long-term gains. The last game that I want to talk about, which I'll run through quite quickly, is a funding game. If we go back to Robin's report, probably the most famous report written about higher education in 1963, his idea was that courses of higher education should be available to all those who are qualified by ability and attainment to pursue them and who wish to do so. The problem is, since then we've seen a massification of higher education, which makes the whole thing much more expensive. If we look at the proportion of money that comes from the public purse for universities, it's very difficult to get reliable stats on this. And this one doesn't include the amount that's underwritten on student loans. But in the UK, we're basically towards the bottom of the list of the table of of countries in terms of how much money is handed over from the public purse to running universities. And that generates headlines. Taxpayer funding of university drops to a 100-year low. And English degree debt is the highest in the English-speaking world. That's a Sutton Trust last week doing comparisons with the American system, which aren't entirely fair because the American system has a different kind of debt and the repayment terms are very different from in the UK. But nevertheless, English debt is probably similar to American debt in terms of higher education now. So how does this play out in language games and public discourses? Well, Oxford and Cambridge University will say that we need higher tuition fees in order to maintain standards. The arguments used are interesting. The VC of Oxford University says, the idea of a market in which every item, regardless of quality, is the same price seems odd. On the other hand, given the great diversity of the institutions in our HE system, the notion of different universities charging different amounts doesn't feel unnatural. It's a current situation that's out of kilter. You often get these metaphors of naturalness when it comes to market, as though the market is itself the most natural thing in the world, and any kind of interference, such as a cap on fees, is inherently unnatural. On the other hand, the situation that we could move to, well, if you look at the postgraduate market, Cambridge then announced earlier this week that it will charge an eye-watering £230,000 for one of its business doctorates. Why? Because the market allows it. Okay, there are no limits on how much you can charge for a business doctorate, and the prestige associated with Cambridge guarantees that there'll be international corporations who'll pay that kind of money on behalf of their employees. The other kind of games that emerge that are interesting, I like this graph because it shows a number of unconditional offers that universities make to applicants. Unconditional offers are very rare. They were down to about 0.3% at one stage. Historically, they used to be used for people who applied to Oxford and they were so brilliant in their interview that Oxford or Cambridge would say to them, we're not interested in your grades, we're going to give you a place anyway, it doesn't matter what your A-levels are. I mean, that's a theory that they're brilliant. In practice, they were normally 10th in line to the throne or something. That was usually what happens. What's happened now in a deregulated context is that we're starting to see universities strategically make unconditional offers, which schools hate because it really demotivates the students. It's not really good for society in any way, but a number of universities, including Birmingham University, have started to make these unconditional offers in different courses on the condition that the student will choose them as their first choice, because obviously each student's worth £27,000. So it's a way in which universities are operating that isn't really in the interest of the whole sector. The other big aspect of the Green Paper last year is about competition. And there are plenty of arguments that the HE sector needs to be opened up much more to stimulate competition. This is Anthony Selden talking, and he says, and I'm not sure you'll all agree, but he says that Lord Adonis and Michael Grove did much over the last decade to open up the school sector to choice and diversity, which has driven up standards and empowered the consumers of education. This is a kind of discourse that we hear. The reality is that competition in higher education so far has been a bit of a car crash. So we've seen thousands of fake students at new higher education colleges who are eligible for student loans but don't really turn up for the courses, and it's almost impossible to recover that money because they won't earn enough to take them over the threshold, or they won't in this country anyway. So we've seen the government support private colleges be accused of wasted millions of pounds by Margaret Hodge and others. And we've seen talk of the private college monster being reined in. But the discourse, the public discourse, really doesn't reflect the reality of this. So Joe Johnson quite recently said, it's like Byron Burgers. I didn't know what Byron Burgers were, but they're a posh burger place in London apparently. It's like Byron Burgers having to ask permission of McDonald's to open up a new restaurant. That's an interesting metaphor because it completely distorts and probably reverses the truth, because it pictures the new providers as the elite hamburger providers, and it pictures the traditional sector as McDonald's. But this metaphor is commonplace. New College of the Humanities are a very powerful, very small private university in London that's currently validated by Southampton Solent University, but they don't want to be validated, they want to be independent. So they really torture this metaphor to death. It's if I wanted to launch a new chocolate bar and you said, please do, but only if Mars Bar says it's okay, and by the way, you must pay Mr. Mars a large sum of money each year, the absolute unfairness would be manifest. Yet this is the system we have in higher education. These are powerful public discourses, which you can see them infiltrating the way into public document, because you can trace this all the way through to the HE Green Paper. Also in the HE Green Paper are some interesting stats about new providers, which show that in 2011, the number of students at new providers, private providers, was 6,600, and this year it's 60,000. So actually what we've seen is a huge rise in new providers, new entrants into the higher education market. I'm very interested in how students are co-opted and how students are positioned and placed within these kind of discourses. So traditionally, one might have assumed that students and universities would be united on the same side in opposition to government when it comes to things like funding. And there's still some evidence of this. So the NUS passed a motion in relation to the teaching excellence framework saying they would be principally disengaged. And of course, there have been protests. But increasingly, we're seeing public discourse like this. This is a piece written by Emran Mian, who was part of the Brown Review and is a journalist. And he says, universities enjoy significant market power. The TEF, as part of a wider effort across the Green Paper, is designed to strengthen the position of students and prospective students via these powerful institutions. So what's happening here is that universities become the bad guys. They become the powerful institutions who control the market, and students become the underdogs who need the government support in order to break down some of these barriers. Joe Johnson says students are looking critically at what they get for their investment, and so must we as a government on behalf of taxpayers. So now the government disappears almost completely from the equation, and what we see is students and taxpayers being united in the public discourse against the universities. And we're seeing this subtle shift, and we'll also see a rise of articles, which I think we need to be a bit cautious about. My students have paid £9,000, says an anonymous academic, and now they think they own me. Which kind of reinforce, albeit maybe unwittingly and maybe with some very good points at the heart of the argument, but reinforce the universities being in opposition to students. And that allows pieces like this to be written. So Fraser Nelson in the Telegraph quite recently talking about pointless degrees that offer their students nothing. What do universities spend the money on? Well, not on academics, not on academic salaries, certainly. Here you can see the line here represents 90th income, the 90th percentile of income. Academics back in 1975 used to be above that level, and they've gradually fallen down. Sorry, it doesn't quite line up necessarily, but the stockbrokers have gone up. So universities aren't spending more money on academics, which is why it's more difficult to get a job in academia. Often capital expenditure is the area in which universities engage in what Paul Temple calls an arms race. So they build new buildings. Russell Group's collective spend on capital projects in the last 5 years has been £9 billion, which they boast is similar to the amount spent on the Olympics or the government's entire railway investment programme. And the only way this is evaluated, it's quite odd that the evaluations tend to be reliant on measurements of income per square metre. And so you can say that during the 10-year period, income per square metre in the higher education sector increased by 34%. So there isn't much mention of pedagogy, whether this makes any difference or whether students actually want it. I did a bit of research on this, I'm going to tell you about now using a case study of a UK Russell Group university, talking to staff, talking to students. We said to the students, what would most improve your learning experience? And they basically said, we'd like more informal contact time with staff, we'd like more formal contact time with staff, but only 4% of them actually talked about better designed buildings. They weren't that interested in the buildings, really. Students said things like, I knew it'd be big, sometimes it's good big, but other times you're just overwhelmed. Another said, there are spaces for learning, big and shiny, and in we go, but there's not much learning. They complained that they weren't having any kind of guided learning. One of them says, in college I knew what everything was for. So there does seem to be a real issue about, at the very least, the way in which these buildings are communicated, even if you account for the expense of them. Staff were equally unpersuaded by the buildings. Some of them said, I don't know all my students, wouldn't recognise half of them. Another said, it's too high tech, we don't get the support. Another said, students are getting atomised and more isolated because why get out of bed if you can do a podcast in your pyjamas? So it was interesting that the sector response to the capital expenditure wasn't positive and probably didn't justify the amount of money involved, and certainly there weren't many pedagogical gains that we could find. I'm interested in the area of educapitalism, but colleagues in MIE know much more than I do. But I was interested in this quote from Pearson that was published recently, who talked about Pearson and a private company that are interested in higher education, and he characterised the role of universities as to build a personalised package that supports students' learning pathway in a truly globalised experience. I don't know what that means. Does anyone actually know what that kind of thing means? Did you know also that universities now have credit ratings? This took me by surprise and only found this out quite recently, but Moody's, for example, rate the University of Manchester as an AA1 issuer of bonds. So that's good news. What we're seeing here, and if you really want to terrify yourself, this magazine called Education Investor is designed only to give advice to people who want to invest in educational ventures, and it presents higher education as an excellent opportunity for such investment as the structures and privatisation model becomes sympathetic to profit. Language games around leadership. We've seen in American universities a change in the way in which universities are led. So there's a chap called Michael Crow, who's president of Arizona State University, who's led this kind of change, who says we are not constrained by isomorphic replication. Other universities don't need leaders, they just copy each other. Clonal replications lead to really bad outcomes in nature. Again, you get the nature metaphor there, and it's the same in markets. And this is starting to weave its way over. So there's, in Stephanie Marshall's new book, there's a quote from the Deputy Vice President of Coventry University who wants to echo the words of Michael Crow in terms of metrics. So we're definitely seeing a pattern here. Consultation, often part of the process of privatisation, might appear to be an evidence-based process, says John Homewood, but what unites the parties, what the parties put forward often is interest-based evidence, and then the government acts as a mediator. I'm interested in how Robbins is co-opted by politicians, but I'm not going to go through that too much. But Lord Robbins actually says in his original report in 1963 that he wants to see the removal of designations or limitations and differentiation because they're wholly alien to the spirit that should inform higher education. On the subject of competition, he says there may be rivalry between different groups of scholars, but there's not in any meaningful sense competition. He argues British archaeologists are enriched, not impoverished, if a colleague from another country unearths a key bit of the jigsaw. So although the discourse, the public discourse, is all about competition, there's an argument that the real core of higher education competition doesn't really play that much of a role at all. One thing I'm working on is a model of structural change in higher education. In other words, what unites the different systems. Had a really interesting conversation with Jill Blackmore from the Australian system last week, and I've looked into the American system. And there seem to be certain patterns which recur. So I'm going to leave you with this. It seems to be that first of all, you prepare the field. You do that by dividing up the sector, and the groups, the mission groups that we all belong to are part of that division. You metricize everything. You instrumentalize learning. There's a normalization of overwork and a marginalization of academics, as Jill talked about last week. There's then this control of common sense discourses. So of course, obviously, higher education is a private good because on average you'll get paid more. Obviously, students are consumers because they're paying all that money they must be. Obviously, competition is good because it floats all boats. And obviously, success is based on merit, not on any structural preconditions. So if you're a successful applicant or a successful university, that's because of your own individual merit. Within this, there's always seems to be an illusion of neutrality. So you have a consultation period, even if you're not really consulting, and you also have very quick evaluation. So you're able to make statements like the fee system is sensible and fair before anyone's actually paid anything. You distract as well. I think this is a big part of it. So recently we've seen David Cameron blast universities for lack of diversity to do with BME entry, even though there isn't really a problem with that. But often these things will take away from the real issue. So that story emerged around the same time that maintenance grants were being turned into loans. David Cameron, name-blind UCAS forms will address race bias. These kind of stories are released to do with higher education. There's lots of us lobbying for changes to UCAS forms, but nobody ever lobbied for name-blind UCAS forms because they don't think that's going to make a big difference. And even going back to Gordon Brown, the war of Laura's rejection, if you remember, Laura Spencer applied to Cambridge University, I think, and didn't make it even though she had great A-levels, and Gordon Brown became very involved with this, even though at the time there were structural changes in higher education that were much more significant. So there's a culture of distraction, and then there's a repositioning of universities, as I mentioned. Universities repositioned in relation to students who are positioned as wanting choice and service, and in relation to taxpayers who are positioned as needing value for money. So you take the university and position it differently. And my overall argument is that these changes to the discourse allow changes to the structure of higher education to go through in a much less contested way. So it may be that you can argue that higher education has always been a game. Nick Hillman says academics have been whinging since the dawn of time. He's head of the Higher Education Policy Institute. The map shows all the universities in Europe in 1960. There's only 2 in England because Oxford and Cambridge refused to let any other universities open. They've been playing games the whole time. Even when they did open for 200 years, they had to be licensed by London universities. So you could say it's not new. The vocational agenda isn't new, as Stefan Collini notes us. In the past, English universities were nurseries of future clerical and administrative functionaries. And the connection between research, although we're very precious about research in the sector, universities haven't always been wedded to research as they are now. I'm going to leave you with that quote from Sarah Churchill, who maybe articulates the opposite and maybe reflects some of my positions, that really we need to think about what society wants. Is it for everything to be a marketplace and a commodity, or should universities be a custodian of knowledge and curiosity and inspiration?
Questions for Steve or comments? I'll start.
Hey, Dave.
I think the alarm bell ringing outside was rather apt, wasn't it? I think you've given us a brilliant exposition of kind of changes that are kicking through in the higher education sector. If I was asked in the school sector when all this happened, because it's in many ways it echoes the kind of changes that happened in the school sector, not directly paralleling necessarily. I'd point to the black papers of the 1970s and such like. I'm wondering where you would locate these kind of changes, because it seems that we're really in this kind of very dramatic change now, and things are moving extremely rapidly. And I think you put together a superb set of data demonstrating that. Where did it all begin, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know.
In the contemporary era, I'm not going back to medieval.
I mean, I guess you could say the changes to higher education aren't inconsistent with changes to other public services. So what's happening in the NHS is very analogous. What's happened in schools, as you say, seem to act as a test case for universities. I think it's part of an ideology that's quite widespread, and I couldn't really put my finger on a single issue. It's interesting that a lot of the changes, I mean, we're due a higher education white paper next week, and there will be approved in the Queen's speech. And it's interesting that the government seem to be pressing ahead with that without any consultation to the sector at all. So I think vice-chancellors, for the first time ever, haven't got a clue what to expect. They don't know what's around the corner. So I do think it's a very central ideology that we're seeing emerging. And I don't know whether there's an equivalent of those black books that you mentioned. I don't know. There could be.
And one could argue it's particularly surprising it's happening in higher education because of the way in which the data, at a global level, if you believe the data, seemingly demonstrates a global success story in higher education.
Yeah.
So, certainly in the school sector, a crisis was manufactured around comprehensive schooling, which was used as a justification for the changes that took place. But seemingly that even wasn't necessary in the case of higher education.
No.
I suspect the Vice Chancellor was really quite shocked at their incredibly rapid marginalisation.
I agree. Fiona?
I was just going to say, there's a few of us here from healthcare education, and George Osborne's announcement just before Christmas that the fees have been taken away from students is massive.
Yeah.
And I love the of the students versus the universities as the big bubble, and also the honest entrepreneur trying to make a living by setting up his organic burger store.
That's right.
These private universities and I mean, we're bracing ourselves, particularly nursing education, private.
It's outrageous. I know it was also one of the promises of the changes to the 2012 system that was broken. Student bursaries were supposed to be guaranteed. The threshold was supposed to stay the same. Maintenance grants were supposed to stay in place, but they very quickly backtracked. And I think once the broader policy is put in place, then it becomes quite easy for policymakers to then tweak the promises made. It's depressing, though.
Have any, I know it's still emerging, but with the green paper, and do you have any confidence that there'll be some sort of hoops and barriers for these independent universities to jump through, some sort of better regulation?
No, I think there'll be lighter regulation. I think that will be the main part of the white paper. They'll move away the regulation and allow institutions to call themselves universities and have degree awarding powers very easily.
Drop of a hat, yeah.
Very good.
About the funding, I wonder whether there are any other sustainable alternatives to e-funding rather than a deregulation of the fees.
Yeah. Well, there was talk of a graduate tax, and I think the idea of a graduate tax is probably more progressive, and the idea of a graduate tax could allow a sustainable model to emerge which allows those who benefit most from higher education to contribute more to higher education. I think the problem with the system we've got now, and the more you tweak around with the repayment methods, is actually the burden falls on middle earners and kind of low to middle earners. If you do a degree and you don't get paid at all, you can't get a job, then you'll be fine. The system at the moment protects you. If you do a degree and go and work on in the financial world and huge incomes, then it's quite a good deal because you've got a huge premium. But for most people in the middle, I think their position is much more precarious and will probably get worse. Now, you might say that might be something that leads to a backlash. I don't think there's public recognition as yet of just how much additional debt is taken on by people that they'll be repaying throughout the middle part of their life.
The information we have, we've been instructed to give information leaflets to prospective students saying, don't worry, you only have to pay a £5 a month back.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's really difficult because you don't want to put students off, but
It is, and that's why I put the stuff up with Martin Lewis, who was very much an enthusiast, and I think had lines very much like that, and has since backtracked. And for the nurses, they won't ever pay off the full amount, so they will actually be making those repayments for the full 30 years after they graduate.
£100,000, you said?
It can be over £100,000, yeah. That's a bit depressing, isn't it? So sorry.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
First of all, could we please get hold of your beautiful
Of
slides?
course, thank you.
Thank you. And secondly, when are we going to have a revolution?
Yeah, okay.
No, I actually mean it. I mean it because it's really quite shocking how things are going, and we're just sitting. I mean, you are not just sitting, but what can be done?
No, I think you're right. I think challenging those dominant discourses is important, and being able to see through some of those dominant discourses. It's very difficult in the higher education world because you hear the same voices who are able to get their comment into the stories before they're published, who are able to influence the debate, who are able to introduce metaphors that are completely inaccurate, but kind of sound as though, you know, people, why should Byron burgers have to ask McDonald's? Everyone wants a Byron burger or whatever. So it's common sense discourse, and I think maybe the right are better at appropriating those common sense discourses. And maybe that's the first line of resistance, but it's not a revolution, is it?
No, I want to go on barricades.
Yeah, we can do that as well. Maybe that's the way forward. Yeah.
Apply for funding for the revolution. We're waiting to hear.
Is there a consultation?
Bruce behind. My comment is about the independent universities. And I don't see why they are fundamentally wrong. You have independent schools, you have independent health providers. So why not universities? As long as they are regulated and regulated in the rest.
It's about the regulation of those universities. I think that's a legitimate point, but Buckinghamshire University is a private university that's been around for many decades. Okay, it's not new. So there's always been a place within the system for private universities. I think what's changing is the ease with which those universities can enter the market, and I think that's what creates concerns. And so far, what we've seen is a number of London colleges emerge very quickly, without necessarily having the kind of mechanisms in place that would protect the reputation of English universities in a global context. And I think a lot of people see dangers with just allowing anyone to award degrees.
Just add that in the United States, for example, some of the most successful universities are
absolutely.
private. I'm talking about engineering, which is my area.
Yeah.
MIT and Stanford.
Yeah.
They're private. And I know the States is different. They have the endowments and whatever.
Yeah.
But still, at the end of the day, they are profit making.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate ideological point to make, but I think there
I'm
are...
not making any ideological arguments, by the way. I'm on the fence, sort of. But
I think the issue is about regulation. I think the issue is about what the advantages are to deregulating the rules by which new entrants can come into the market. And we've seen a very sudden shift in that deregulation after really hundreds of years without much change.
It's not marketisation, no, it's this idea that politicians say we need more nurses, so let's just take the cap off the numbers.
Yeah.
Anybody can train nurses because we need more nurses. And it's healthy competition.
Yeah.
It's just based on, you know, we're not flogging cars, we're educating people.
And that really captures it all. I think this is
a nice
the
quote,
most important thing, because it has become so sort of commercialized and numbers game and game in general, and really it is about unleashing, you know, intellectual curiosity, and that's almost is forgotten.
It is, yeah, and particularly with the increasing focus on employability and the instrumental side of higher education and the ways in which funding repayment mechanisms might go in future, by which I mean the government are now in a position to link how much you pay for a degree to how much you earn afterwards, because they've connected up the tax data that people pay with through the student loans company, and that opens up all kinds of possibilities, because you could say you could find all kinds of ways of charging people differently across the course of their life for their degree. Sorry, Erica.
Firstly, so sorry I was late,
Okay.
and I had to clear up from the previous seminar, and that was just an incredible whirlwind tour and very illuminating in lots and lots of ways. Thank you. And I was, I don't know, whether you want to say anything about selling of the student loan book and Phoenix and all of that, but I do have another question too that's takes it back to the UCAS statements actually. And I just thought the thing that stayed with me is this phrase, stand out from the crowd. How long has that been in the advice? Because it encapsulates the individualist project and the psychological model of the individual and the mob, and the impossibility, the whole kind of idea that group relations are something to avoid, and collaborative activity, etc.
Yeah, I hadn't taken it that far. I think that's a really interesting point because so much of the policy is an attack on collegiality and collaboration. And I hadn't thought of the application process as being part of that, but you're absolutely right. It's about the UCAS personal statement is an opportunity to assert your individualism, to assert yourself as something different and better from the other applicants, and that's how UCAS frame it. And as long as
that installs the subject, that subjectivity that co-opts the student into the governmental discourse.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right.
But it's also implicit, like I said before, about education becoming a private good, and in particular higher education shifting from being public good to a private good, and in a way that discursively unquestionable. The policy doesn't brook any opposition whatsoever in relation to debates about the public nature of higher education. It's almost like we've won that debate, we're not even going to discuss that in film. And the same is increasingly true of secondary and primary education, perhaps even more shocking.
Stephen?
Thanks for that, Steve. Well, that was absolutely brilliant. And I just thought one of the slides there, in fact, two of them, the University of Buckinghamshire appeared, and I just thought how depressingly predictable that social capital should play the same role here as we're seeing in other sectors in education, where social networks coalesce around powerful new figures to consolidate and reproduce discourses which serve to marginalise. And I was looking at the statement put out by Sir Michael Wilshaw the other week about how the National College had failed and we needed something new, and to set out this brave new world, and it should definitely be centred and based in the University of Buckinghamshire. Well, how random.
But it's anything but random.
Massively not. So thank you.
I agree completely. Should we leave it there? Thank you very much.